On to Iowa now, where the state's Supreme Court acknowledged that just because something is unfair, that doesn't necessarily make it illegal. Late last week, the court ruled in favor of dentist James Knight, who fired his dental assistant for being, quote, irresistible. This despite the fact that he described her as the best dental assistant he ever had. 32-year-old Melissa Nelson, a married mother of two, had been working at the office for over 10 years when Knight gave her a month's severance and then a swift kick out the door back in 2010. His reason? Nelson was a direct threat to his marriage because he was attracted to her. Now, apparently Dr. Knight asked Mrs. Nelson to repeatedly wear looser clothing. The thing is that she says she wore scrubs to work each day. Now, the dentist's wife, who also works at the nearly all-female office, was most infuriated when she found out the two were exchanging text messages, although the messages were described mostly as work and family-related messages. However, according to the gender discrimination lawsuit filed by Melissa Nelson, if the conversation did turn inappropriate, it was always initiated by Mr. Knight himself. It's also important to note that the two never engaged in any sexual activity of any kind. Now, you're probably thinking the same thing I was when I first read the story. At first glance, it seems like a case that has gender discrimination written all over it. But the state Supreme Court judges ruled in Mr. Knight's favor, saying that Mrs. Nelson's termination did not constitute as gender discrimination under the Iowa Civil Rights Act, a ruling that Mr. Knight's attorney, Stuart Cochrane, says was completely justified. He went on to say this: "We do think the Iowa Supreme Court got it completely right. Our position has always been Mrs. Nelson was never terminated because of her gender. She was terminated because of concerns her behavior was not appropriate in the workplace. She's an attractive lady. Dr. Knight found her behavior and her dress to be inappropriate." But here's another interesting moment from this case. According to the Iowa Supreme Court, the justices said that Dr. Knight acknowledges he once told Mrs. Nelson that if she saw his pants bulging, she would know that her clothing was too revealing. And then there's this. This is a picture of the Iowa Supreme Court. Notice anything off here? Well, in case it escaped your eye, the Supreme Court is an all-male panel, leading many to say that the 7-0 unanimous ruling in favor of Mr. Knight was unfair and discriminatory in and of itself. This isn't the first case of its kind in Iowa, but it is an interesting ruling on the Iowa Supreme Court's part. And this case is based on an Iowa state law, so it will be difficult for Mrs. Nelson and her legal team to pursue the case much further. But there has been a lot of text written about the case, and perhaps dentist Knight can most relate to author Oscar Wilde, who famously said, quote, "I can resist anything but temptation."